Kyle Martinez pressed his face against the cold window of the transport ship and watched Mars grow larger in the viewport with each passing moment. The red planet had been his home once, a lifetime ago when he was just a boy who believed his father would always be there to protect him from the darkness that lurked in the corners of the universe. 14 years had passed since that terrible night when his father vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a hole in Kyle's heart that never quite healed no matter how far he traveled, or how hard he tried to forget. The ship shuddered as it entered the Martian atmosphere, and Kyle gripped the armrests of his seat until his knuckles turned white. He had spent those 14 years running from his past, working on cargo ships and mining operations in the outer colonies, always moving and never staying in one place long enough for the memories to catch up with him. But something had changed 6 months ago when a mysterious message arrived on his personal comm device, encrypted with a code that only he and his father knew, a code they had created together during those long evenings when his father taught him about stars and planets and the infinite possibilities that waited among them. The message was simple and contained only coordinates pointing to Mars Colony 7 and a date exactly 1 week from when Kyle received it. There was no explanation and no signature, but Kyle knew in his bones that this was connected to his father somehow, and that he had to return home no matter how much it scared him to face the ghosts he had left. Behind Colony 7 looked different from orbit, with new domes spreading across the surface like metallic mushrooms, and ships coming and going in a steady stream of commerce and activity. When Kyle was young, the colony barely had 5,000 people, and everyone knew everyone else's business. Now the population had swelled to over 50,000, and the place had transformed from a small mining outpost into a bustling hub of interplanetary trade. The landing was smooth, and Kyle made his way through customs with his worn travel bag slung over his shoulder. The customs officer barely glanced at his identification before waving him through, and Kyle stepped out into the main terminal where hundreds of beings from dozens of different species milled about, speaking in languages he couldn't understand. The air smelled different here, recycled and filtered, but still carrying hints of the red dust that covered everything on Mars. Kyle had booked a room at a cheap hotel near the old district where he used to live, and he walked through streets that felt familiar yet strange at the same time. Some buildings remained unchanged, like old friends waiting patiently for his return, while others had been torn down and replaced with gleaming new structures that reached toward the dome ceiling high above. He passed the school he attended as a child and the park where he used to play with other kids whose names he could no longer remember. The hotel room was small and cramped, with a narrow bed and a tiny bathroom, but it was clean, and that was all Kyle needed. He dropped his bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank wall and wondering what he was supposed to do now. The coordinates from the message pointed to the central plaza but gave no indication of who or what he was supposed to find there. Sleep did not come easily that night, and Kyle lay awake listening to the sounds of the colony settling down for the artificial night cycle. His mind kept returning to that last evening with his father when they had dinner together and talked about Kyle's upcoming birthday. His father had seemed distracted and kept checking his comm device every few minutes, but when Kyle asked if something was wrong, his father just smiled and said everything would be fine. That was the last time Kyle saw him alive, or at least the last time anyone saw him, because later that night his father left their apartment and never came back. The colonial security forces searched for weeks but found no trace of him, and eventually declared him missing, presumed dead. Kyle and his mother had been forced to leave Mars because they couldn't afford to stay without his father's income, and they moved back to Earth where his mother's family lived. Morning came slowly, and Kyle showered and dressed in clean clothes before heading out into the colony. The coordinates led him to the central plaza, a large open space surrounded by shops and cafes where people gathered to socialize and conduct business. Kyle found a bench near the fountain and sat down to wait, though he had no idea what he was waiting for. Hours passed, and the plaza filled with the morning crowd. Kyle watched people come and go, merchants setting up their stalls selling goods from across the galaxy, children running and playing while their parents shopped, couples walking hand in hand. He was about to give up and return to his hotel when he saw her standing near the fountain, looking directly at him as if she had been waiting for him all along. She was unlike anyone Kyle had ever seen before, with features that marked her as non-human. Her ears came to elegant points that peeked through long silver hair that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. Her eyes were the color of violets, deep purple with flecks of gold that caught the artificial sunlight streaming through the dome above. She wore simple clothing that somehow looked elegant on her slender frame, and she stood with a grace that suggested nobility or royalty. But what really caught Kyle's attention were the two creatures standing beside her. They were dragons, there was no other word for them, though they were smaller than the legendary beasts from Earth's ancient stories. Each was about the size of a large dog with scales that shifted between shades of blue and green, depending on how the light hit them. Their wings were folded against their serpentine bodies, and their golden eyes watched Kyle with an intelligence that made him uncomfortable. The woman smiled and began walking toward him, and the dragons followed at her heels like well-trained pets. Kyle stood up from the bench, unsure whether to run or stay, but his legs felt frozen, and all he could do was watch as she approached. When she was close enough to speak without shouting, she stopped and regarded him with those strange violet eyes. Her voice was soft and melodic, like music from an instrument Kyle had never heard before. She spoke in perfect standard English with just a hint of an accent that suggested it was not her native language. She said her name was Luna White, and that she had been waiting a very long time to meet him. She said she knew his father, and that she had important information to share with him, but not here in the open where anyone could overhear. She asked if he would come with her somewhere, private and safe. Kyle should have been suspicious and cautious, because nothing about this situation made sense, but something in Luna's eyes told him she was speaking the truth. He nodded, and she smiled again before turning and walking away. Kyle followed her through the plaza with the dragons trailing behind them, and he wondered what he had gotten himself into, and whether he would finally get the answers he had been searching for all these years. Luna led Kyle through winding streets that took them away from the busy commercial district and into older sections of the colony that had seen better days. The buildings here were original structures from when the colony was first established, weathered and worn by decades of use and exposure to the harsh Martian environment. Few people walked these streets now, and those who did kept their heads down and moved quickly, as if they didn't want to be noticed. The dragons padded silently behind them, and Kyle found himself glancing back at them every few minutes. They were beautiful creatures despite their alien nature, with scales that caught what little light filtered through the dome and reflected it in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. Occasionally one would spread its wings slightly as if testing the air, and Kyle could see the delicate membrane stretched between the thin bones that looked too fragile to support flight, yet somehow did. Luna didn't speak as they walked, and Kyle was grateful for the silence because his mind was racing with questions. How did she know his father, and what information could she possibly have that would bring him back to Mars after all these years? Why had his father been involved with someone like her, someone who was clearly not human, and who walked around with dragons as if it were the most normal thing in the world? They reached an old industrial sector, where warehouses stood empty and abandoned, their doors sealed with rust and neglect. Luna approached one particular building that looked no different from the others except for a small symbol carved into the metal doorframe. A symbol that Kyle recognized with a shock that hit him like a physical blow. It was the same symbol his father used to draw in the margins of his notebooks, a complex geometric pattern that Kyle had always assumed was just an absent-minded doodle. Luna placed her palm against the door, and it slid open with a soft hiss revealing darkness beyond. She stepped inside without hesitation, and the dragons followed. Kyle paused at the threshold, feeling the weight of the decision before him. Once he crossed this line, there would be no going back to his simple life working cargo runs and trying to forget. But hadn't he already made that choice when he returned to Mars? The interior of the warehouse was dark, but as soon as Kyle stepped inside, lights flickered to life, revealing a space that was far from abandoned. Equipment filled the room, computers and scanners and devices whose purpose Kyle couldn't begin to guess. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, suggesting it had been some time since anyone had been here, but the machinery still hummed with power. Luna walked to the center of the room, where a table held what looked like a standard datapad. She picked it up and activated it with a touch, and a holographic display sprang to life above the table, showing an image of a man Kyle recognized immediately, despite the years that had passed. His father looked younger in the recording, with less gray in his hair and fewer lines around his eyes, but it was definitely him. The Recording began to play, and Kyle heard his father's voice for the first time in 14 years. His father said that if Kyle was seeing this message, then something had gone wrong, and he had been unable to return home as planned. He said that he was sorry for leaving and for keeping secrets, but that everything he had done was to protect Kyle and his mother from forces that would not hesitate to hurt them to get what they wanted. Kyle's father explained that he had been working on a classified project for the colonial government, a research initiative that was investigating unusual energy readings coming from deep beneath the Martian surface. What they found changed everything humans thought they knew about Mars and about the history of the solar system. Buried kilometers below the surface was an ancient structure built by a civilization that predated humanity by millions of years. The structure was massive, a complex of chambers and corridors that extended for miles in every direction. Inside, they found technology that seemed like magic, machines that could do things human science said were impossible. But the most important discovery was what they called the archive, a crystalline device that contained the accumulated knowledge of the ancient civilization, including secrets about faster-than-light travel and energy generation and medical advances that could revolutionize human society. Kyle's father said that once the government realized what they had found, everything changed. The project was classified at the highest levels, and everyone involved was sworn to secrecy. But his father became concerned when he learned that certain people wanted to weaponize the technology rather than use it to benefit humanity. He tried to raise objections through proper channels, but was told to keep quiet and do his job. That's when he met Luna. She had come to Mars as part of a diplomatic delegation from Silvara Prime, representing her people who had been aware of the ancient structure for generations. The Elven people had their own legends about the builders of the archive, and they believed that the knowledge contained within was too dangerous to be controlled by any single species or government. Luna had been sent to Mars to assess the situation and to make contact with someone within the project who might be sympathetic to their concerns. Kyle's father and Luna worked together in secret to create a backup of the archive's contents and to establish a security system that would prevent unauthorized access. They fell in love during those months of working together, united by their shared goal of protecting the knowledge from those who would misuse it. But they were discovered, and the government moved to arrest them both. His father had only minutes to act. He used his access codes to seal the archive behind security measures that required both human and elven genetic markers to unlock. Then he erased his own access from the system and went into hiding, knowing that if he was caught he would be imprisoned or worse. He recorded this message for Kyle as insurance, as a way to pass on the truth in case he never got the chance to tell his son in person. The recording ended with his father saying that he loved Kyle and that everything he did was to give his son a better future. He said that Kyle shouldn't try to find him because it was too dangerous, but that one day when the time was right, Luna would reach out and explain everything. He said that Kyle had a choice to make about what to do with the knowledge his father had protected, and that whatever Kyle decided, his father would be proud of him. The hologram faded, and the room fell silent. Kyle stood frozen, trying to process everything he had just heard. His father hadn't abandoned him, hadn't run away because he didn't care. He had been trying to save humanity from itself, and in doing so had sacrificed everything, including his family. Luna spoke softly, saying that she was sorry Kyle had to learn the truth this way. She explained that she had been monitoring the situation for years, waiting for the right moment to make contact. The dragons were gifts from her people, bonded to her through ancient magic and capable of detecting deception and danger. They had kept her safe during the long years of waiting. She said that Kyle's father was still alive, but in hiding somewhere even she didn't know. He had cut off all contact to protect everyone involved. But now, after 14 years, the political situation had changed and new people were in power who might be willing to listen to reason about the archive. That's why she had sent the message to Kyle, because it was time to make a decision about what to do next. Kyle asked what she expected from him, and Luna said that together they could unlock the archive and decide whether to share its secrets with humanity or keep them hidden until humans were ready for such responsibility. But she couldn't do it alone because the security system his father created required Kyle's genetic signature as well as her own. Kyle looked at the dragons who watched him with those intelligent, golden eyes, and then back at Luna. He thought about his father and all the years they had lost, and all the questions that remained unanswered. He thought about the responsibility being placed on his shoulders and whether he was strong enough to carry it. Finally, he nodded and said he would help her, but he wanted answers, real answers about everything. Luna smiled and agreed, and Kyle knew that his life would never be the same again. Luna explained that accessing the archive would not be simple or without risk. The facility where it was located had been sealed by the colonial government and was now officially designated as a restricted zone with security measures that would detect and respond to any unauthorized entry. They would need to plan carefully and gather supplies before attempting to infiltrate the site. Over the following days, Kyle stayed in the warehouse with Luna and the dragons, learning everything he could about the archive and the ancient civilization that created it. Luna had brought with her a collection of elven texts and historical records that described the builders as a race called the predecessors, who had mastered the manipulation of space and time itself. According to elven legend, the predecessors had seeded the galaxy with their knowledge in hidden repositories, hoping that younger species would eventually evolve to the point where they could understand and use it wisely. The dragons, Luna explained, were more than just pets or guardians. They were ancient creatures that had existed alongside the elven people for thousands of years and possessed abilities that human science couldn't explain. The blue-green one was named Cascade and could sense changes in electromagnetic fields, making him invaluable for detecting security systems. The slightly smaller one with more green in her scales was called Meridian, and she had an instinctive understanding of spatial relationships that allowed her to navigate through complex environments without getting lost. Kyle found himself fascinated by the dragons and spent hours watching them interact with Luna. They communicated through a combination of sounds, body language, and what Luna described as a form of telepathic bonding that she shared with them. She could sense their emotions and they could understand her intentions even without spoken commands. Kyle wondered what it would be like to share that kind of connection with another being. Luna also told Kyle more about herself and her people. She was indeed a princess of Silvara Prime, the only daughter of the ruling council and trained from childhood in diplomacy and leadership. But she had always been drawn to adventure and exploration, rather than the responsibilities of court life. When the mission to Mars was announced, she had volunteered immediately despite her family's concerns. Meeting Kyle's father had changed her life in ways she never anticipated. She had come to Mars expecting to deal with typical human arrogance and short-sightedness, but instead found someone who understood the bigger picture and was willing to risk everything for principles rather than personal gain. Their love had been unexpected and complicated by the differences between their species, but it had also been real and deep. Kyle asked why she had waited so long to contact him, and Luna explained that she had been monitoring him from a distance for years, making sure he was safe and that no one from the government had tracked him down. She had wanted to reach out sooner, but Kyle's father had been adamant that his son should have a chance at a normal life away from the dangerous secrets they were protecting. Only recently had circumstances changed enough to make contact necessary. The government officials who had wanted to weaponize the archive had gradually been replaced by new administrators who were more interested in scientific advancement than military applications. Luna believed there was now a chance that if they could access the archive and demonstrate its potential benefits, they might convince the authorities to use the knowledge responsibly. It was a slim chance, but better than leaving the archive sealed forever, or allowing it to fall into the wrong hands. Kyle spent his evenings working with Luna to plan their infiltration of the restricted zone. They studied maps and security protocols that Luna had obtained through her diplomatic connections. The facility was located about 50 kilometers from the colony, in a region of deep canyons and volcanic caves. Access was restricted to authorized personnel only, and the entire area was monitored by satellites and automated defense systems. Their best chance was to approach during one of the regular dust storms that swept across the Martian surface. The storms would interfere with sensors and provide cover for their movements. Luna had acquired a small vehicle that was modified for rough terrain and equipped with stealth technology that would help them avoid detection. The dragons would fly alongside them, able to scout ahead and warn of any dangers. As the days passed, Kyle felt himself growing closer to Luna. She was unlike anyone he had ever known, strong and intelligent but also kind and patient. She answered his endless questions about elven culture and her home world, and in return he told her stories about growing up on Mars and his years working in the outer colonies. Sometimes in the evenings they would sit together watching the dragons play, and the silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. Kyle also found himself thinking more about his father and trying to understand the choices he had made. It was easy to be angry about being abandoned, but knowing the truth made it harder to hold on to that anger. His father had been trying to protect something important and had sacrificed his own happiness to do it. Kyle wondered if he would have the same courage if faced with similar choices. The night before they planned to leave for the restricted zone, Kyle couldn't sleep. He lay on the makeshift bed Luna had set up for him in one corner of the warehouse and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the dragons breathing as they slept near Luna's sleeping area. His mind kept returning to the recording his father had made and the weight of responsibility he was accepting. Luna must have sensed his restlessness because she appeared beside his bed carrying 2 cups of a warm beverage she called starflower tea. She sat on the floor next to him and they drank in silence for a while before she asked what was troubling him. Kyle admitted that he was scared, not of the physical danger they would face, but of making the wrong decision about the archive. Luna said that fear was normal and even healthy because it meant he understood the seriousness of what they were doing. She told him that in elven culture there was a saying that translated roughly to "the weight of knowledge is lighter when shared." They would make decisions together, and whatever happened, they would face the consequences as partners. Kyle found comfort in her words and in the steady presence of the dragons who had opened their golden eyes to watch them talk. Morning came too quickly, and they spent the early hours making final preparations. Luna checked their supplies and equipment while Kyle studied the maps one more time, committing the route to memory. The dragons seemed to sense the tension and were more alert than usual, pacing around the warehouse and occasionally spreading their wings as if preparing for flight. The dust storm was scheduled to arrive by mid-afternoon, and they planned to leave the colony just before it hit. Luna had filed a false flight plan claiming they were conducting geological surveys in an area far from their actual destination. It wouldn't hold up under scrutiny, but it would buy them enough time to reach the restricted zone before anyone realized where they had really gone. They loaded the vehicle with their gear and sealed the warehouse behind them. The trip through the colony was tense because they had to pass through several checkpoints, but Luna's diplomatic credentials got them through without incident. The guards barely glanced at Kyle and completely ignored the dragons who rode in the back of the vehicle as calmly as if they made this trip every day. Once they cleared the outer perimeter of the colony, the Martian landscape opened up before them in all its stark beauty. Red rocks and dust stretched to the horizon, broken only by the occasional crater or canyon. The sky above was already beginning to darken, as the dust storm approached, carried on winds that howled across the surface with nothing to slow them down. Luna activated the vehicle's stealth systems and they began the journey toward the restricted zone. The dragons took flight, soaring above them on wings that seemed too delicate to support their weight, but moved with effortless grace. Kyle watched them through the vehicle's windows and felt a strange mixture of excitement and dread about what lay ahead. They were committed now, and there was no turning back. Within hours, they would either unlock the secrets his father had died to protect, or they would be captured, and everything would have been for nothing. Kyle looked at Luna, who was focused on navigating the increasingly rough terrain, and he realized that whatever happened, he was glad not to be facing it alone. The dust storm hit with the force of a living thing, a wall of red particles that reduced visibility to almost nothing, and buffeted the vehicle with winds strong enough to make it shake. Luna kept her hands steady on the controls and her eyes fixed on the navigation display that showed their position relative to the restricted zone. The dragons had descended and were now running alongside the vehicle, their bodies low to the ground as they used their natural instincts to navigate through conditions that would have grounded any aircraft. Kyle monitored the scanner, watching for any sign that they had been detected by the facility's security systems. So far, the storm was doing its job of masking their approach, but he knew that once they got closer, the automated defenses would become more sophisticated and harder to fool. His heart pounded in his chest and his mouth felt dry despite the water bottle Luna had insisted he drink from regularly. After 2 hours of driving through the storm, they reached the canyon system that housed the facility. The walls of red rock rose up on either side of them, creating a natural corridor that funneled the wind into even stronger gusts. Luna slowed the vehicle to a crawl as she navigated between boulders and around obstacles that appeared suddenly out of the swirling dust. The dragons ranged ahead, scouting the path and occasionally returning to guide them around dangers. The entrance to the facility was hidden behind what looked like a natural rock formation, but Kyle could see the telltale signs of human construction in the two perfect angles and the faint shimmer of an energy barrier. Luna brought the vehicle to a stop about 100 meters away and shut down all unnecessary systems to minimize their electronic signature. They sat in silence for a moment, gathering their courage before the real danger began. Cascade approached Luna's window and made a low thrumming sound that she seemed to understand. She told Kyle that the dragon had detected multiple layers of security, including motion sensors, thermal cameras, and what appeared to be an automated weapon system. They would need to disable the defenses before they could reach the entrance, and that meant getting close enough to hack into the control system. Luna pulled out a small device that looked like a modified datapad and explained that it was elven technology designed to interface with most electronic systems. Her people had developed it for situations exactly like this, when they needed to access secured facilities for diplomatic or intelligence purposes. She would need to get within 10 meters of the security hub, which was located inside a small bunker near the entrance. Kyle volunteered to go with her, but Luna shook her head and said she needed him to stay with the vehicle and monitor for any response from the colony. If security forces were dispatched, they would need warning time to abort and escape. Kyle didn't like the idea of her going alone, but he understood the logic and reluctantly agreed. The dragons would accompany Luna and provide protection if needed. He watched through the dust-obscured windshield as Luna and the dragons disappeared into the storm. The minutes stretched out, feeling like hours, and Kyle found himself checking the scanner obsessively, looking for any sign of trouble. The wind howled around the vehicle and dust peppered the windows with a sound like rain. He had never felt so helpless, sitting and waiting while others risked their lives. 20 minutes passed before Luna emerged from the storm with both dragons flanking her. She was breathing hard and her silver hair was matted with red dust, but she was smiling. The security systems were down, she announced as she climbed back into the vehicle, and she had managed to do it without triggering any alarms. The facility's automated systems thought they were experiencing a malfunction caused by the storm. They drove the vehicle right up to the entrance, which was now accessible with the energy barrier deactivated. The massive metal doors were sealed, but Luna used her device to override the lock mechanism, and they slid open with a grinding sound that made Kyle wince. Beyond was a corridor carved out of the rock and lined with lights that flickered on as they entered, responding to motion sensors. Luna parked the vehicle just inside the entrance, and they gathered their equipment, including portable lights and the scanning devices. They would need to locate the archive. The dragons seemed uneasy as they entered the facility, their heads low and their tails twitching. Kyle wondered if they could sense something that humans and elves couldn't, or if they were just reacting to the unfamiliar environment. The facility was larger than Kyle had expected, with corridors branching off in multiple directions and rooms filled with equipment that must have been used during the initial excavation and research. Everything was covered in dust, and the air had a stale quality that suggested no one had been here in years. Luna consulted a map on her device and led them deeper into the complex, following a route that would take them to the excavation site where the archive was located. They walked for what felt like hours, descending deeper into the Martian crust through tunnels that had been drilled through solid rock. The temperature dropped steadily until Kyle could see his breath, and he was grateful for the thermal gear Luna had insisted they wear. The dragons breathed small jets of flame, periodically providing warmth and additional light that danced off the tunnel walls. Finally, they reached a chamber that was different from the others. The walls here were not rough-hewn rock, but smooth and covered with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change when Kyle looked at them directly. This was not human construction, but something far older and more sophisticated, the architecture of the predecessors. In the center of the chamber stood the archive, a crystalline structure about 3 meters tall that pulsed with a soft blue light. It was beautiful and alien and slightly terrifying all at once. Kyle felt drawn to it, as if the crystal was calling to him on some level below conscious thought. Luna gripped his arm gently, pulling him back from his trance. She explained that the archive was protected by a final security measure that Kyle's father had implemented. To access it, they needed to provide genetic samples simultaneously, one human and one elven. There were 2 panels on opposite sides of the crystal, and they would need to place their hands on them at the same moment. Luna warned that there might be some discomfort as the archive scanned them, but that it shouldn't cause any permanent harm. Kyle and Luna took their positions on opposite sides of the crystal. The dragons watched intently, their golden eyes reflecting the blue light. Luna counted down from 3, and on 0 they both placed their hands on the panels. Kyle felt a jolt of energy run through his body, not painful but intense, like touching an electric fence. The crystal blazed with light so bright he had to close his eyes. When the light faded and Kyle opened his eyes again, the chamber had changed. Holographic displays filled the air around them, showing images and text in a language that looked nothing like any human or elven writing. But somehow Kyle could understand it, as if the archive was translating directly into his mind. He could see Luna experiencing the same thing, her eyes wide with wonder as she turned in circles trying to take it all in. The archive contained everything the predecessors had learned during their millions of years of existence. Designs for ships that could cross between galaxies, methods for generating unlimited clean energy, medical knowledge that could cure diseases and extend life, weapons that could destroy planets, and most incredibly, information about the nature of reality itself and how to manipulate the fundamental forces of the universe. It was overwhelming, and Kyle felt his knees go weak as the sheer scope of the knowledge washed over him. This was what his father had died to protect, what Luna had waited 14 years to access, and now the question was, what would they do with it? The power to reshape human civilization was literally at their fingertips, but power without wisdom was just another form of destruction. Luna spoke softly, saying that they needed to be careful and selective about what they took from the archive. They could copy specific information that would benefit humanity without providing the means to create devastating weapons. They could give humans the knowledge to solve their energy crisis and cure diseases while holding back the more dangerous applications until humanity proved it could be trusted. Kyle agreed, and they spent hours carefully selecting which files to download to the storage devices they had brought. They worked through the artificial night, copying carefully selected information from the archive onto encrypted storage devices. Kyle focused on medical technology and energy generation, while Luna chose navigation systems and communication methods that could help connect the scattered human colonies across the galaxy. They deliberately avoided anything that could be weaponized or used to harm others, choosing instead to give humanity the tools to build rather than destroy. The dragons remained vigilant throughout the process, occasionally prowling around the chamber or sniffing at the crystal structure as if trying to understand it through their own senses. Cascade seemed particularly interested in the holographic displays and would pause to watch the images change, while Meridian kept her attention focused on the entrance to the chamber, alert for any sign of danger. As dawn approached, on the surface far above them, Luna suggested they should prepare to leave. They had gathered enough information to make a real difference, and staying longer only increased the risk of being discovered. Kyle agreed, though part of him wanted to remain and learn everything the archive had to offer. He understood now why his father had been so protective of this knowledge, because in the wrong hands it could be catastrophic. They made their way back through the tunnels, moving more quickly now that they knew the path. The facility remained empty and silent, and Kyle allowed himself to hope that they might actually escape without confrontation. But as they approached the entrance chamber, that hope was shattered by the sound of voices and the harsh glare of searchlights. Colonial security forces had found their vehicle and were setting up a perimeter around the entrance. Through the narrow opening, Kyle could see at least a dozen armed officers and what looked like a military-grade transport. Someone must have noticed their departure from the colony and traced them here. Despite the storm and the false flight plan, Luna pulled Kyle back into the shadows, and they crouched behind a stack of old equipment while the dragons pressed themselves flat against the floor. She whispered that they needed another exit and pulled out her mapping device to search for alternative routes. The facility had been designed with multiple access points for safety reasons, and there should be at least one emergency exit somewhere in the complex. Kyle's mind raced, trying to think of options. They could try to negotiate with the security forces, but that would mean surrendering the storage devices and all the information they had gathered. They could try to fight their way out, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Or they could find another way out and hope they could reach the vehicle before being caught. Cascade made a soft chirping sound and nudged Luna's hand with his snout. She looked at him for a moment, as if listening to something Kyle couldn't hear, then nodded and told Kyle that the dragons had found another passage. It was narrow and would require them to crawl for part of the way, but it led to a service entrance on the far side of the canyon about 2 kilometers. From their current position, they had no choice but to trust the dragons and follow them deeper into the facility. The passage Cascade led them to was indeed narrow, and Kyle had to remove his pack and push it ahead of him as he crawled through sections where the ceiling was barely half a meter high. Dust and small rocks rained down on them as they moved, and Kyle tried not to think about the tons of rock above them or what would happen if the tunnel collapsed. After what felt like an eternity of crawling, they emerged into a wider corridor that sloped upward toward the surface. The emergency exit was sealed, but Luna's device made quick work of the lock, and they stumbled out into the early morning light. The dust storm had passed, and the Martian sky was clear, showing the pale sun rising over the canyon walls. They were on the wrong side of the canyon from where they had left the vehicle, with no transportation and security forces probably already searching for them. Luna looked exhausted, and Kyle knew he must look even worse, covered in dust and breathing hard from the exertion. But they still had the storage devices and the information that could change everything. Meridian spread her wings and took flight, circling above them, while Cascade remained on the ground. Luna watched the dragon's flight pattern and then smiled despite their desperate situation. She explained that Meridian was scouting and had found something useful. They followed Cascade as he led them along the canyon floor to where an old maintenance vehicle sat abandoned and half buried in sand. The vehicle looked ancient, and Kyle doubted it would even start, but Luna was already working on the control panel, using her elven technology to bypass the security systems. After several tense minutes, the engine coughed to life with a sound like grinding metal. It wasn't pretty, but it ran, and that was all they needed. They climbed aboard with the dragon settling into the cargo area, and Luna gunned the engine. The vehicle lurched forward slowly at first, but gaining speed as the systems warmed up. Behind them, Kyle could hear the sound of aircraft engines and knew their escape had been noticed. The chase was on. Luna drove like someone possessed, pushing the old vehicle to its limits as they raced across the Martian surface. The pursuing aircraft were faster, but the canyon system provided cover, and Luna used every twist and turn to her advantage. The dragons took flight and began harassing the pursuing craft, breathing fire at their sensors and forcing the pilots to take evasive action. Kyle held on tight as Luna sent them careening around corners and over jumps that made his stomach drop. He could see the colony in the distance growing larger as they approached, and knew that their only chance was to reach the diplomatic quarter, where Luna had protection under interplanetary treaty. If they could get there before being caught, the colonial authorities would have to negotiate rather than simply arrest them. The pursuing aircraft fell back as they entered the colony's airspace, unwilling to risk civilian casualties in a populated area. Luna didn't slow down until they reached the gates of the diplomatic compound, where elven guards were already waiting, having been alerted by signals from Meridian. The guards ushered them inside and sealed the gates just as colonial security vehicles arrived outside. Safe behind the compound walls, Kyle and Luna collapsed in exhaustion. The dragons landed nearby, looking pleased with themselves and not at all tired despite the chase. Kyle checked the storage devices and confirmed that all the data was intact. They had done it. Against all odds, they had accessed the archive and escaped with knowledge that could change the course of human history. Over the following days, Luna negotiated with the colonial authorities. She explained what they had done and why, emphasizing that they had only taken information that would benefit humanity and had deliberately left behind anything dangerous. She offered to share the knowledge they had gathered if the government agreed to use it responsibly, and to work with the elven people to ensure it was distributed fairly. The negotiations were tense, but eventually a compromise was reached. The archive would remain sealed, but under joint human and elven oversight. The information Kyle and Luna had gathered would be studied by an international committee of scientists and ethicists who would decide how and when to release it. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was better than leaving the archive under the control of a single government or destroying the knowledge entirely. Kyle's father emerged from hiding once he learned what his son had accomplished. The reunion was emotional and complicated, with 14 years of hurt and misunderstanding to work through. But they had time now and the freedom to rebuild their relationship without the shadow of the archive hanging over them. Luna returned to Silvara Prime, but promised to visit often. She and Kyle had formed a bond during their adventure that transcended the differences between their species. The dragons would miss Mars, she said, but they were pleased that the knowledge of the predecessors would be used wisely. Kyle chose to stay on Mars and work with the committee, overseeing the release of the archive information. It was important work that would take years, but he felt connected to it in a way he had never felt connected to anything before. His father's sacrifice had not been in vain, and the future that humanity was building would be shaped by the choices they had made. Sometimes in the evenings, Kyle would stand on the observation deck and look up at the stars, wondering what other secrets the galaxy held and whether humanity was ready to find them. But those were questions for another day. For now, he was content knowing that he had honored his father's legacy and helped give humanity the tools to reach for a better tomorrow.